all night to potentially run up and rescue Robert if he needed it. Last year, we launched our very first graphic novel, and it went great. I mean, it made the New York Times bestseller list, so thank you all so much for making that happen. But ever since this book came out, we have been hit with so many questions about, hey, when are you gonna do another graphic novel? When's book 2 coming out? Well, I have an announcement to make. Check it out. We are doing a second graphic novel, and this is the official cover art. Here it is. This is Mr. Ballin Presents Where Nightmares Live. It's gonna have another set of 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and it comes out September 30th. But you can pre-order it right now if you go to book.ballinstudios.com. Also, there's a link right here and in the description below. There are some signed copies available, but they will go quickly. So please head on over to book.ballinstudios.com to pre-order a copy of our newest graphic novel. I know you're gonna love it. Check it out. Your nightmares are waiting. Around 3 hours later, all of Robert's friends were sitting on the floor in the servants' quarters playing blackjack. It was almost midnight, and all of them were exhausted, but they were too on edge to sleep. They were so focused on this bell, and they were so worried about Robert and, wondering if he was really okay up there. And they also had become convinced that, maybe the bell would ring and they wouldn't hear it if they were making too much noise. And so they had made this decision to silently play blackjack and just focus exclusively on this bell. But it had really created a lot of extra tension in the room. They're basically all just staring at the bell, dealing one hand after another, paranoid it would go off, and wondering what would even happen if it did. And so hand after hand, the friends are playing blackjack, anxiously watching this bell being completely silent, and then suddenly they hear this sound that makes them all jump. But it wasn't the bell. It was a blood-curdling scream coming from upstairs. And for a moment, the friends just sat there in shock, and then they got up and began running out of the servants' quarters to see what was going on. And as they did, Robert's bell began ringing furiously, so loud it hurt their ears. And so they charge out of the servants' quarters and literally bump into Charles, who also is coming to figure out what's going on. And as a group, they begin running up the stairs to the second floor. And all the while, the bell is ringing furiously. There's screams coming from Robert's bedroom. And by the time they got to the second floor, suddenly everything went silent. The ringing stopped, the screaming stopped. They're in the second floor in that hallway, and it's just deadly silent. And up ahead of them is that closed door. And so Charles and the group, they begin walking down the hall, having no idea what to expect. And right as they're about to reach the door, they hear this loud bang sound, and then silence again. Seconds later, Robert's friends were at that door, pounding on it, screaming for Robert, come open the door, because Robert was the only one with the key. But Robert wasn't making any noise, the room was still totally silent, and so eventually the friends began kicking on this door to try to break it down. All the while, Charles is just kind of standing back in the hallway, watching this horrible thing unfold. And then finally, the friends manage to literally kick the door in. I mean, it's a 100-year-old house. The door gets kicked in, and the friends stumble into the room, and they look over towards the bedroom, and they all just freeze in shock. When Charles bought this townhome 10 years earlier, it came with a very dark backstory. The previous owner had apparently kept his violent and psychotic brother locked up inside of this second floor bedroom where Robert was. And after this brother died inside of this room, all these strange and frightening things began happening inside of this room. People began hearing these awful wailing sounds coming out of this room when nobody was in there, and then they'd go into the room and the wailing would stop, but furniture had been moved all around the room, even though, again, no one had been in there to do that. And then also, people began seeing this sort of amorphous gray figure sort of moving around inside of that room, especially at night, and slinking up against the wall and across the floor. And even though nobody had any idea what it was, it just felt like it was evil. And so they began calling it the nameless thing, and they referred to it as the physical manifestation of evil. However, not everybody believed this story. In fact, one person who absolutely did not believe the story was Robert Warboys. He thought this was just a tall tale designed to scare people. And so when his friends dared him to spend one night inside of that bedroom where supposedly the nameless thing lived, he happily accepted, because to him, it didn't seem risky at all. Spending one night in the haunted room was no big deal because it's not actually haunted. He'd be fine. And anyways, it would make for a great story to tell down at the Gentleman's Club. Unfortunately though, the night in that bedroom did not go as Robert hoped. When Robert's friends burst through the bedroom door and looked inside, the first thing they noticed was the bell pull, the ribbon from the ceiling, had been yanked out of the ceiling, and Robert's pistol was on the ground next to the bed. And then on the other side of the room, there was a very obvious bullet hole in the wall. And so that was the loud bang sound they heard as they were coming down the hall. It was the pistol going off. And then there was Robert. Robert was laying on the bed, and he was totally rigid, and he actually was still clutching the red ribbon from the bell pull. And as they stared at him, they saw his eyes were wide open and bloodshot, and his lips were kind of pulled back in this horrible grimace with his teeth exposed. And for a second, his friends thought Robert must be having a seizure of some kind. That's why he was so tight on the bed like that. And so they ran to him, trying to snap him out of it. But as soon as they touched him, they realized that the reason he was rigid was not because of a seizure. It was because Robert was dead. That night, Charles would call the local coroner, who would come by and take Robert's body, and also he would open up an official inquest into Robert's death to figure out what had happened to him. And the verdict of this inquest was that Robert had died from massive heart failure caused by unknown circumstances. But to Charles and all of Robert's friends who were there that night and actually saw Robert in the room, it seemed plainly obvious that what had happened here was Robert had come in contact with the so-called nameless thing in that room, and it literally scared him to death. In the nearly 200 years since Robert's death, 50 Berkeley Square has had many different owners, and virtually all of them have reported either seeing, feeling, or hearing some sort of malevolent, ghostly presence inside of that second bedroom. To this day, that particular bedroom, where the nameless thing apparently resides, is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mr. Ballin Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballinstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see you. Today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to show you the haunting photo or photos that are famously associated with them. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're at the Like Button's house, please secretly sneak into their fridge and replace all of their vanilla ice cream with mashed potatoes. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 10 p.m. on January 31st, 2012, a 23-year-old man named Chen Rongyu walked into an internet cafe in New Taipei City, Taiwan. The cafe had a front counter where a cashier would check you in and sell you snacks and drinks, and then from where he was looking, behind the cashier were all these tables, these long rows of tables with different computer stations at them. And there was at least about 30 people already sitting behind each of these terminals, fully engrossed in whatever game or whatever they were doing on the internet. And not one of these people even looked up when Chen walked inside. I mean, nobody was interested in Chen. But for Chen, that was sort of part of the allure of this cafe. He got to, sit down and play his game and be totally left alone. And so Chen walked up to the counter and paid for some time. He also bought a soda, and then he walked around back, he found his computer, sat down, and immediately fired up his favorite game, League of Legends. League of Legends is a multiplayer online battle arena game that's extremely popular all over the world. And Chen took this game very seriously. He routinely would spend 8-hour-long marathon sessions at this internet cafe just playing League of Legends to try to level up and move up in the ranking system. And so today, that's what Chen was going to do. And so after the game was booted up, he immediately locked in and he was in his first battle. And then before long, hours had gone by and he hadn't even gotten up. And then eventually, a couple times he got up to get a soda refill and to get a snack. But I mean, he basically just all night gamed, just nonstop, periodically stopping to literally put his head down on the table and take a 15-minute power nap, only to get right back up and get back into the game. And so all night, he's just on this game. By a little after noon on February 1st, Chen had been gaming nearly nonstop for 14 hours, which was long even by his standards. But he couldn't stop now. He was exhausted, but he was doing great. This is like one of the best sessions he had ever had. And right at that moment, he was in the middle of this really intense match where his team was about to get knocked out by this really good opponent. And if Chen could just lock in, they could pull out a win. And so Chen was super focused, leaned forward, hands flying across his keyboard and mouse, and he managed to dodge an attack, and then he geared up for the big strike. And right as he did, something went wrong. About 9 hours later, around 9 p.m., the cashier at this internet cafe had just finished giving another soda to one of the customers, and then they looked out and she noticed there was nobody else in line. Now, the job of this cashier was not just to check people in and give them snacks and drinks. It was also to keep the cafe clean and also, critically, to periodically make rounds and kick people out once their time had expired. Because oftentimes, a lot of these gamers would get sucked into their games, lose track of time, and basically end up playing for longer than they'd actually paid for. So the cashier grabbed her clipboard with all the information about each of the customers and how long they had paid for, and then she began making her rounds in the back. And part of it was she needed to speak basically to all the people that were there and kind of confirm that they were supposed to be here still. But as she walked into the back, per usual, nobody looked up at her. I mean, all these people at all their terminals were heads down, fully focused on their game, I mean, completely immersed. And so she began going, one person to the next, being like, hey, are you good? Did you pay for your time? Are you gonna be here any bit longer? And a lot of these guys, they'd finally look up and be totally shocked she's even standing next to them because they weren't paying attention at all. But, one by one, she checked each of the monitors, and eventually she got to Chen. And when she got to Chen, Chen was focused on this game entirely to the point where when she said, hey, your time is up. You've been here for 24 hours. You paid for, 8 or 9 or whatever it was. Chen didn't even look up at her. I mean, nothing she could do could get Chen to even acknowledge her. He was so focused on the game. And so eventually the cashier, out of frustration, was like, hey, and she kind of tapped his shoulder, and Chen leaned back. And when he did, and the cashier got a good look at him, she screamed. It would turn out, until this very moment, Chen had gotten his wish. He had come to this cafe 24 hours earlier and been totally left alone. He got to exclusively just play his game in his own world. In fact, the whole time he was here, no one had even looked at him. Because if they had, they would have seen something was horribly wrong. It was the cashier who walked over to him and tapped on his shoulder who noticed what was wrong. Here's what the cashier saw. This is a picture of Chen. And Chen is in full rigor mortis. Because 9 hours earlier, when he was in the middle of that really intense fight with that opponent who was about to beat Chen and his team, Chen, he got really excited and he was about to land that big strike that potentially could have been the blow that would have won the match. Well, he was so amped up that Chen had a heart attack and died. And for the 9 hours after he died, when he was still in the same position he was in playing the game, nobody noticed. He just sat there appearing to be fully alive, walked into the game like everybody else, but he was actually dead. And so it wasn't until the cashier tapped Chen on the shoulder and he rocked backwards, still in his gaming position, but because he's in rigor mortis, his hands kind of jutted out in front of him up into the air, that she realized he was actually dead. Chen's family would later say that he had pre-existing heart issues that very likely contributed to his fatal heart attack. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. As the weather warms up and the days get longer, it can be exciting, but also kind of overwhelming. In the winter, we all kind of get to hibernate and stay in our houses and kind of avoid the world. But now, with the days getting longer and sunnier and brighter and everybody's outside, there's like this societal push to get out there and be active and hit your fitness goals and be social and also clean your house. It's like, be the best version of yourself right now. And so, of course, every spring, right around this time, I start to feel really self-conscious because I see all my friends and family posting their amazing lives on social media, looking like they are absolutely becoming the best versions of themselves. And I feel like I'm not doing enough to compete with them. And so to me, it's really no wonder that statistically speaking, anxiety actually does spike in mid to late spring. Luckily, my sponsor, BetterHelp, is here to help. And their licensed therapists are ready to support you right now. The majority of BetterHelp members report reduced anxiety symptoms after only 6 weeks. And it's easy to start. All you have to do is fill out a questionnaire, and then BetterHelp will pair you with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. Also, you can easily switch therapists at any time at no additional cost until you find the right fit. With over 7,000 reviews and a 4.3 rating on Trustpilot, BetterHelp is a platform you can trust. Let BetterHelp help you rule your anxiety so it doesn't rule you. Click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin for 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to the stories. On the afternoon of October 11th, 2023, a 48-year-old man named Samuel Gomez stood in the lobby of the Moxie Hotel in Portland, Oregon, talking to the concierge. Samuel had flown in from Phoenix earlier that morning because he was speaking at a conference in Portland later that week. But for now, he was just gonna go out and enjoy the sights, and so he had asked the concierge to give him some local recommendations. The concierge named a few cool local places. Samuel thanked him, then he headed out the front door onto the road. And as soon as Samuel was outside, he immediately heard this loud commotion happening right down the street. And he turned and looked in the direction, and he saw this kind of gaggle of people and cars sort of standing in what looked like a big circle around whatever was happening over there. Samuel couldn't tell what it was, but people were honking and people had their phones out filming sort of whatever was in the middle of the circle. And from the looks of it, it appeared there was at least one police officer in his car sort of beginning to marshal the scene and block traffic. But, there was just this chaotic scene happening, and Samuel really had no idea what it was. But naturally, being a human, he was interested. He wanted to see what was going on. And so Samuel began walking down the road, and as he did, he pulled out his phone, opened up his camera, and began filming and taking pictures. As he got closer to whatever was going on here, the cacophony of horns and people yelling and all the chaos just got louder and louder, and it still wasn't clear at all to Samuel what the heck the scene was. And so he just continued to take photos and just kind of be an onlooker. And at some point, when Samuel got right up close and actually was standing right near that police officer blocking traffic, he happened to turn his phone and aim his camera at the police officer. And when he did, he took a photo. Here is the photo he took. As you can see, the police officer is aiming his gun directly at Samuel. And that's because this is not a police officer. Samuel just thought he was a police officer. When he looked down the road at this crazy scene, he saw this guy in a car who sort of appeared to be, maybe an undercover cop, sort of, in the right place at the right time, taking charge and handling whatever this was. When in reality, this man who's in this photo is a guy named Jeffrey Hammond who had just been involved in a road rage incident, and he shot and killed a 47-year-old man named Ryan Martin. That was the scene that Samuel had walked out to. Jeffrey Hammond shooting and killing Ryan Martin. That's what everybody was reacting to. And so as Samuel walked down the road, not knowing that, he inadvertently stood right in front of the shooter, who was still sort of crazed, aimed his camera at him, right as Jeffrey Hammond swung his gun around and shot Samuel. So like literally seconds after this photo was taken, Samuel got shot. Luckily though, Samuel would survive the shooting. As for Jeffrey Hammond, he was arrested and charged with murder, and as far as we know, he is currently in jail awaiting trial. On April 5th, 2018, a young man named Luis Hernandez sat inside of a small stone shack with a metal roof on a rural property in northern Venezuela. Luis was a painter, and for the last year or so, this shack had doubled as both his home and his art studio. And it was basically always a mess. There was dirty dishes and food everywhere, and all his paint supplies were scattered all over the ground. But the walls were all adorned with all of his beautiful and most prized possessions, his artwork. He mainly painted really dramatic-looking portraits in very bold colors. In fact, when he was actually doing his painting, when he was in the middle of the floor, right in the center of his shack, on one wall, there was this face of a man he had done, all in red, and then on the left, on the other wall, was this woman's face, all in blue, but with bright red lips. And these paintings were both so intense that at times, as he was doing his work, it sort of felt like they were both looking at him. But on this particular day, as Luis sat in the middle of his shack, working on his latest project, he put that weird thought out of his mind that, his paintings were watching him, and just focused instead on getting this done. He had one more beautiful portrait he was working on, and he took his paintbrush and he dipped it in black ink, and he put the finishing touches on. And when this portrait was done, Luis kind of sat back and took it all in, and he couldn't help but feel a bit emotional. Because this project, it was different than any other he had ever done. He wasn't doing it for fun, he wasn't doing it for pay. He was doing it as a way to cope with a big crisis in his life. So this shack where Luis worked and lived, and also the rural property that it sat on, belonged to Luis's boyfriend, Lisandro Rosales Garcia. Lisandro and Luis had met about a year earlier when Luis was really down on his luck and was actually homeless, living out on the streets. But Lisandro had seen Luis and offered to let him come live in this shack on his property, which was out in the middle of nowhere. And Luis, who's got no other options, is like, awesome, yes, I'd love to do that. And so he moves out into the shack, and pretty quickly after moving in, Luis and